Well, tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Greetings from Tamakimakoro, Auckland. My name is Murray Bruges. I'm the director of the Helen Clark Foundation. Before we get started with today's webinar, we'll open with a short mihi and karakia from Tania Pouwhare, General Manager, Community and Social Innovation at Auckland Council. Tania.
Karanga te pō, karanga te ao, karanga te kaupapa o te rā. Ki ngā kaiwhakahaere o tā tātou wānana o te rā, ko te Helen Clark Foundation, tēnei te mihi mahana ki a koutou. Ko koutou te korowai manaaki o tō tātou hui, he take whaitikana, tēnā koutou. Tēnā kōrua ki a Ganesh me Max, kia tonu, kia toa tonu aki. He mihi whakawhitai ki a kōrua, mō kōrua mahi whakamārama, tēnei tamihi. Kia koutou te iwi mai ngā haue whā, he mihi nui kia koutou. Ko Tania Pouwhare ahau no ngai tūhoi. Me timatana tō tātou hui ki te karakia. Manaua mai te maurinuku, manaua mai te maurirangi, ko te mauri kai au, he mauri tipua. Ka pakaru mai te pō. Tau mai te mauri, haumi e, hui e, tāiki e. Nō reira, mālo ni whakalofa lahi atu, kia rana, tālofa lava, mālo e lelei, tālofa nisa bula venaka noa ia, Māori, tēnā koutou katoa, and warm Pacific greetings to you all. Nau mai, hara mai, whakapiri mai, whakatata mai, piki mai, kake mai, Māori ora.
Kia ora, Tania. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon's webinar, Exploring Inequality in New Zealand in 2023, its consequences for different parts of our society and the policy choices we can make to meaningfully address it. A very warm welcome to our foundation members. The Helen Clark Foundation is an evidence-based, independent and non-partisan think tank, and we couldn't do what we do without the support of our members. If you're not a member of our foundation and you enjoy this webinar, please do consider supporting our work by becoming a member at Helen Clark, that's all one word, helenclark.foundation, or by signing up for our free newsletters. We'd be thrilled to have you, and I think there'll be a link to our website in the chat section. Before we begin today's webinar, I'll just quickly note that our foundation has a webinar on key global economic and geopolitical trends and their implications for New Zealand, with Helen Clark interviewing special guest David Skilling on 2 November at 8 p.m. That is now open for registration. David is a dynamic and highly knowledgeable commentator on geopolitics and economics, so it promises to be a great session. We also have several other exciting webinars planned, so do keep an eye out for those. And just a little bit about today's webinar. For those of you who haven't joined many of our webinars before, it's worth noting that this is not a normal Zoom call. You're not on camera, you can't unmute, so there's no risk anyone can see or hear you eating your lunch. But nonetheless, we'd love for you to participate in this webinar, and the best way to do that is to submit questions as they occur to you throughout the webinar by typing them into Zoom's Q&A function, which you can access at the bottom of your screen. You can also vote for questions others have asked by clicking on the thumbs up button. And the more votes a question gets, the more likely it is to be asked during the Q&A session. You'll also see there is a separate chat function, and we'll use that section to drop links during the webinar, but please do put your questions into the Q&A area. So today's webinar will begin with a structured panel discussion with our panelists each answering a couple of questions about inequality in New Zealand. At around the 35 or 40-minute mark, we'll switch to a Q&A session. And at that point, I'll put the questions you've entered into the Q&A section to today's panel. That's it for housekeeping. So I'll now ask our panelists, Ganesh, Tania, and Max, to introduce themselves, and then we'll get into the discussion. Ganesh, can we start with you? And then I'll ask you to hand over to Tania and then to Max. So Ganesh.
Thank you, Murray, and thank you all for your time. Kia ora tātou. My name's Ganesh Nana. I'm chair of the Productivity Commission to Komihana Whāihua Aotearoa, and an economist by trade. I'm born and bred New Zealander, first generation New Zealander, acknowledge Māori as tangata whenua Aotearoa, and acknowledge all your tupuna, my tupuna and our tupuna who have come here from lands far away to settle this place and make it better for all of us. Kia ora.
Kia ora anō koutou, ko Tania Pouwhare ahau, he urio no ngai tūhoi, ko au te kaiwhakahaere matua o Community and Social Innovation, kai te kaunihiro Tāmaki Makaurau. Kia ora again, everyone. My name is Tania, and I'm the General Manager of Community and Social Innovation. We are part of Auckland Council, and our very specific job is innovation and the disruption of inequality in South and West Auckland. Kia ora.
Kia ora, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thanks to the Helen Clark Foundation for organising this. Delighted to be on this panel with Ganesh and Tania. My name's Max Rashbrooke. I've written and edited several books about economic inequality in New Zealand. I'm a senior research fellow in the School of Government at Victoria University. And if anything I have to say is of interest today, I've got a website, maxrashbrooke.net, where you can sign up for updates on my articles and books and other things I'm working on. But other than that, looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Max. Thanks all. Okay, so we'll now start our structured panel discussion, and we'll start with a question to Dr. Nana. The Productivity Commission's recent Fair Chance for All inquiry found those experiencing persistent disadvantage to number 697,000. What's behind this number, and is there a sense that this number is getting larger or smaller?
Well, I suppose what's behind this number is the way we defined persistent disadvantage for an empirical perspective at the least was to look at three different domains of disadvantage. Poverty, which we measured through income poverty, some indicators of exclusion, and some indicators of doing without. And so those were three different domains, and we looked at survey data, in particular census data, to identify those who were disadvantaged in both the 2013 census and the 2018 census. And so that's where that number comes from. There's arguments about how do we define disadvantage, how do we define exclusion, how do we define doing without. But that's effectively, from a numerical or a statistical perspective, despite our best efforts, that's the best we could do in terms of the pure numbers. There's a whole lot of other things that we would like to do, but unfortunately it just shows the lack of data and the lack of knowledge that we have about persistent disadvantage. And so that's one of the, I suppose, findings and recommendations out of the inquiry. But I suppose what fundamentally drives those numbers undoubtedly is the four barriers that we identified that stop people to move themselves out of persistent disadvantage. And those four barriers that we identify and discuss a lot in that report, and we take that from numerous engagements across the motu as part of our inquiry. One was the undoubted the power imbalances that exist within the system, and we did focus on the public management system, so that's the broader public sector and the way they manage supports and services to help people and communities. So there's the power imbalances within that system. There's the embedded or ongoing impacts of racism and colonisation that are embedded in that system. There's the inherent short-term bias within the system and the short-term status quo bias within the system that effectively means the only interventions or suggestions that come out are peripheral or marginal and not systemic change. And the last one is the one that's probably familiar to most, undoubtedly, is the problem or the challenge of government operating in silos, and despite the best efforts, I acknowledge the changes over the last few years in getting government agencies engaged with each other and talking to each other, we still get that continual feedback about those in persistent disadvantage having to tell their story several times to different agencies to access the supports and services that they require. And that's frustration, and that reinforces, I suppose, that that whakamā, that's that sense of that belittling that takes away their mana if they continually have to reinforce or tell their story to a different person, to a different agency. And so those barriers are what we highlight as stopping people getting themselves out of disadvantage, or not just people, their communities. And I think that's what drives or underpins that number. And we can, as we said in the inquiry, we could put up recommendations that, dare I say, tinker at the edges. But until we get that fundamental system change, which addresses those barriers, the power imbalances, the racism and colonisation, the government operating in silos, and the short-term status quo bias, unless we address those four barriers and change the systemic responses within that criteria, we won't make too much of a dent in that 690,000 number.
Thanks, Ganesh. I should note, panelists, you're most welcome to pick up on any points that Ganesh has made in your answers. But my next question is for you, Tania. And what worries you most about inequality in Aotearoa New Zealand?
Oh, many things. I guess that it is the trajectory is a downward one and a widening one. We're not making the types of gains in tackling inequality that we should do. So, for example, some excellent research that Bill did for us based on 2018 integrated data infrastructure data. It showed that 50% of all Māori here in Tāmaki Makaurau are in low-paid jobs. Now, the statistics of that, of what that does collectively for Māori, when you have that proportion of our people stuck in go nowhere, low-paid and sunset jobs. So, income inequality is still not a nut that we have cracked, but perhaps even worse than that is the wealth inequality that has just grown and grown and grown over the last 20 years. There are things we can do around income inequality, active labour market policies and that type of thing, but it is wealth that we are able to transmit down through generations. And I'm talking about wealth in a very broad sense. Yes, financial wealth, because actually that does matter, but it's also about agency and mana motuhake and having time for leisure and having control over one's life as well. So just in the way that toxic stress and trauma gets passed down through generations, so it is the opposite, of positive positive experiences and being able to have safety nets and all of that type of thing that you can then pass down generations as well. But to Ganesh's point about power, income matters, yes. Wealth matters, absolutely. But it's power, because who at the end of the day gets to decide what is the point of the economy and for whom. And as long as we have alienation, which is growing, and we've seen that in the most remarkable events over the last 3 years of things that we'd never witnessed before in this country. For me, it is particularly about who gets to decide what is public good and for whom. I think the thing I worry most about, and I worry about this for our children and our children's children and future generations, is our social fabric. I think it's looking pretty frayed.
Yeah.
I think our social contract is incredibly strained, and I worry about the knock-on effects that it has at a very neighbourhood, whānau community level, and that is that unequal societies create unsafe ones. They diminish the collective altruism that's necessary to live in a fair and good life. And then on top of that, this endemic of, you know, we've got climate change is not on our doorstep, it's in our house. And we have stored up all of these problems for our kids and their kids. And I feel very worried indeed about what their futures might look like.
Kia ora, Tania. Thank you. Max, next question for you. Could you describe the link between economic inequality and unequal opportunities in Aotearoa New Zealand?
Yes, thanks, Murray. It's a really good question, and one which I think follows on very directly from what Tania in particular was talking about. And it's an important question because you sometimes hear people say, I think particularly conservatives, you know, that the real issue isn't economic inequality, it's unequal opportunities. But in point of fact, you can't really separate those two things because, you know, it's I think reasonably obvious that if children grow up in households that have got very different levels of wealth and income, then they're going to have very different starts in life. In my book, Too Much Money, I talked about how, you know, some children from wealthier families are effectively on an up escalator, you know, from the moment they're born, sort of irrespective of what they do, because their parents can afford to have them in housing that's warm and safe and dry, and which doesn't make them sick, and, you know, can afford to invest in their education and buy them the laptops they need for their schooling. There's a quiet place for them to do their homework, and then, you know, they have a house in the zone for the desirable sort of high schools from which the most prestigious university courses recruit, and so on and so forth. And conversely, there's all these barriers in the way of low-income families, you know, who are trying to do the right thing and trying to lift themselves up and work to their strengths, and those are some of the barriers that Ganesh has talked about. And so we know internationally that the more economically unequal a country is, the less equal are the opportunities as well. So in a country like the United States, you can predict half of your income as an adult from what your parents earned. You know, so arguably half of your sort of economic choices that determine your income aren't even your choices, they're predetermined. Whereas in Denmark, that figure is just 15%. And in New Zealand, it's probably somewhere in the middle, 25 to 30%. And just to that, just sort of finish answering this, thought I might share one image which speaks to the recent New Zealand research on this, and hopefully that's coming through for people. And basically what the graph is showing is on the horizontal axis, it's sort of ranking parents from poorest 0 to richest 100, and then it's looking at where their children end up, what's their rank in the income distribution. And you can see very clearly from the graph that basically the richer your parents are, on average, the higher you will end up in the income distribution, the richer you will be. And as the researchers of this paper, which came out last year, said, you know, the relationship is almost perfectly linear, except if anything, it's slightly stronger at the top. So there are outsized advantages to being born to really rich parents, but it all just underlines that basic point. If you don't have more equal incomes, if you don't have a narrower, you know, distribution of income, if you don't have a world in which everyone is living up in a house, is growing up in a household where they've got enough to live well, then you are going to have unequal opportunities.
Thanks, Max. Just a reminder to our webinar viewers today, please put your questions into the Q&A area. You can do that at any point while people are talking, and then we'll get to them at about the 35 or 40-minute mark. So next question for you, Ganesh. The Productivity Commission's inquiry made a set of 20 recommendations. What drove these, and which of these would you highlight?
I'll answer that question in the context of the last couple of discussions as well. And I'd just like to pick up Tania's conversation about the social contract, because I share that quite wholeheartedly. And I think that's the driver of it. And without wanting to speak to the converted, I'd actually indicate that question about the social contract is actually taxing many people's minds at the moment. And I'm reminded, and I put up quite often in my presentations, a a Financial Times editorial coming out in April 2020. And so that was, just at the start of the pandemic. And the key thing was it was written by the Financial Times, and that's a UK newspaper for, dare I say, the business people who tend not to be overly concerned about inequality or any of those other measures. I'm stereotyping, obviously, but I do find it quite clear and quite informative that the Financial Times can come out with an editorial at the time which says, and it's headlined, "Virus lays bare the frailty of the social contract," literally using your words, Tania. And I think that coming from that sphere is quite a clear signal that things are, dare I say, broken in that contract between community, people, and the economy and business. And we've got to start thinking about what does that social contract mean, and dare I say, in the context of Aotearoa in the 21st century. And one of the recommendations in terms of our inquiry, while we don't specify I'm just trying to flick through to the actual wording of it, establish and maintain measures describing a social flaw that will enable us to embed in a social contract. Now, what is that social flaw? Well, we argue in the report that it could be, you can come at it from two perspectives. One, from the clear business perspective or the economy perspective, you need to ensure that there's that you have your social license to operate, so that you have the acceptance to be here as a business and I can engage with community and employ people. Or you can come at it from a rights-based perspective. Other people come at it from a rights-based perspective. But irrespective of what that perspective is, there are elements of that social flaw that we as a nation need to discuss and establish. Do we have a right to a house? Do we have a right to X amount of food? Do we have a right to a job? All of those sorts of things. Some people will say yes or no to those. Sometimes that's implicit, but I think somewhere in there now is the time to be explicit. But even if you take the rights-based perspective, what's the other side of the equation? What's the obligations coming back the other way? So as a society, I have, or I may have, as being relatively privileged, I have an obligation to ensure that as an employer, that I employ my people properly, I pay them a proper wage, I look after them in terms of health and safety. The contribution coming back is that I expect my employees and my workers to be engaged in the work and to be healthy and all of those sorts of things, and bring to me their issues if they're not. But whereabouts at that community level. So in terms of driving our other recommendations, one of the core principles, obviously that social contract is one of them, about trying to rebalance that power imbalance. The core principles that drove our recommendations, one was to strengthen the influence of Te Tiriti. We've got to recognise and understand that Te Tiriti is the foundation for that social contract. Empower the voices of people and communities experiencing persistent disadvantage, but they're the voices that are not being heard in designing the system, let alone the interventions. And Wellington bureaucrats like myself don't have all the answers, and it's time for us to actually admit we don't have the answers. The answers are out there in their communities. Much of the work that Tania and her colleagues are doing, that signal where the answers are. We need to empower those. Other element, the short-term, long-term stuff, we need to value long-term investments. And lastly, we need to integrate the learning and evaluation. So we need to try stuff and learn from it and figure out whether it works. And not, if it doesn't work, not start pointing fingers, but if it doesn't work, figure out how we can learn from that and design new programs rather than this blame game. Rather than, oh, it didn't work, so I'm going to take your contract away from you because you didn't deliver. If we're serious about long-term investment, we've got to have much longer-term contractual models, if that's the right word, or models of delivery that actually enable communities to design their own programs. And the one other key core recommendation that I'd like to put in front of you is that long-term stuff, embed in the system a voice for the longer term. We recommend the establishment of a parliamentary commissioner for future generations. So we have that, literally, we have that voice of the future at the decision-making table. Got it.
Thanks, Ganesh. Next question is for you, Tania. and it is what are some solutions to inequality in New Zealand? But I might also ask you, if you're open to it, to reflect on, given that you raised it, to reflect on the social fabric and the social contract in New Zealand as well. There's a question about that, and Ganesh has just reflected on it. So it'd be interesting to hear your reflections, and then perhaps if you could move into some solutions to inequality in Aotearoa New Zealand. Thank you, Tania.
Okay. When I talk about the social fabric, I'm talking about the relationships that exist between all of us. And I would also think of it as a metabolism, and is it a healthy metabolism? So there's relationships that, you know, that I have with my neighbours, obviously my whānau, but then there's complete strangers. You know, how do I behave and act toward other human beings?
Yeah.
So how, you know, what's the strength of that? Am I a bystander and willing to just kind of, you know, as long as it doesn't touch me, I'm going to keep out of this? Or am I someone that cares about what happens to other people in my community, including complete strangers? So that's kind of what's meant by social fabric. And social contract is the language that's used to describe the relationship between us and the state, us and the economy. And I would also, you know, kind of reflect back on where that came from. And, you know, for us, I think that the social contract is really ripe, and picking up on Ganesh's point about te tiriti, is really ripe for us to reimagine what that social contract can look like. I think people think that distrust is, or the lack of trust in institutions like the public sector, which I work in, is the opposite of you know, what the social contract should be. But it's not just distrust, it's alienation.
Yeah.
So how can we reimagine the social contract? If we're going to do it, let's do it now. It seems to me that there are enough red flags that this needs serious reconsideration. In terms of solutions, there is no single silver bullet. I think, picking up on Ganesh's point again about the short-term bias that we have in policy and investment decision-making, and I'm talking as a public servant, is a major barrier for us to tackling the root causes. So to Max's point about children, the best investment we can make is in the first 1,000 days of a child's life. That sets the trajectory for the rest of their life. And the science is undeniable in this. By the time we're doing, you know, kind of prototypes at disrupting inequality further down the line as the rangatahi or pakeke, you know, and they're older, the horse is already bolted. We need to stop the horse from bolting in the first place. All we're doing is creating an industry responding to the failure demand, and there is a lot of that. And the bravery that is needed by our public servants and by our politicians to say, no, this is a 20-year endeavour. I was the beneficiary of some really fantastic science-based policies by the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gordon Brown, in the United Kingdom. So, for example, I got a fresh fruit and vegetable grant when I was hapu. My daughter, when she was born, she got what's called a child's ISA. It was an amount of money to be invested that she can draw on when she's 18. And of course, the compound interest and the little gifts from her nanny and all the rest of it go in there as well. By the time she's 18, that will pay for hopefully more than 1 year of university. So, you know, these were long-term policy decisions where there was no immediate political payoff. I always, you know, kind of, when we went into COVID, I kind of looked at what kind of public sector do we need? And it's the entrepreneurial public sector. It was the public sector that could balance common sense and smart risk taking. Like, for example, you know, the first Labor government the state housing, building of state housing, that has paid dividends for generations and generations and generations. Notwithstanding that Māori weren't entitled to state housing until 1950. Nevertheless, and when I look at what Roosevelt did in the Great Depression of the US, and half of all trees that are in the States at the moment were planted by the Civilian Conservation Corps set up during the New Deal. He employed 10,000 out of work writers, artists, editors, librarians, the cultural economy, the creative economy, and recorded real life, ordinary lives of Americans. Also sent them out to record the history of 2,000 elderly by then African Americans who had been emancipated from slavery. Now, if we didn't have those records, those archives, it might be a very different narrative about slavery. Oh, it wasn't so bad, etc., etc. So these things pay on and on and on. What I fear we have is a technocratic and administrative public management system. And what we need is a bit more of what we saw during the Great Depression, and the ability to get on and do things that we know aren't going to pay off within a political term, but we know we have to do them anyway. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Tania. Max, final question for the structured discussion goes to you. Which policies could be most effective in reducing economic inequalities and thus help to equalise opportunities in New Zealand?
Yeah, thanks, Murray. Just before I answer that directly, a couple of reflections on what's already been said. I mean, I think Tania's quite right to identify the fraying of those connections between people, and of course that's one of the first impacts of a society that's more divided economically. We often think about the problems of poverty and inequality in terms of their impacts on individuals, the way in which they hold back or create barriers to individuals' aspirations, and that's certainly very profound. But they also weaken us as a society. We have evidence, for instance, that in Auckland, as Auckland has become more divided, as sort of rich have come to live around rich and poor around poor, people have become less likely to sort of take their skills out of their own community and go and volunteer in other communities. So the connections between people weaken. I've also seen research showing that very wealthy New Zealanders don't support more redistribution, which is by itself a very banal finding. But the reason in the psychological research is that they take their reading for how well the country's doing from their neighbours. And of course, because their neighbours are all doing as well as they are, they've actually lost sight of what is going on for how the other half lives. And so economic inequality has these very real problems for the social fabric. In terms of what we do about it, I'd possibly take a slightly different tack from Ganesh. I mean, I'm not at all against the idea that public services need to be joined up and sort of more driven by community needs rather than top down. But, I think about sort of the boldness of the first Labour government that Tania talked about, where they just got on and did stuff. They just built stuff. The first Labour government built 30,000 state houses during a world war, and they didn't, sort of worry about whether everything is a complex adaptive system with unintended consequences. They just did it. So in terms of what I'd do about tackling economic inequality, I mean, we need 40,000 state houses, to address the shortfall that's built up since 1991. And a big push on affordable housing generally. That's one of the big things I do on wealth inequality. On income inequality, it's got to be boosting lower incomes. I think we need something like the Green Party's guaranteed minimum income, welfare that respects people's dignity, that isn't stigmatizing and demeaning to get, and which gives a stable foundation for them to work out what their aspirations are. And we need to do more to support people back into high quality paid work where that's appropriate for them. Again, Tania mentioned active labour market programs, those sorts of training and skills programs. Some Nordic countries spend billions of dollars a year on that stuff. Other than mana and mahi, we do relatively little of that here in New Zealand. Also, we need to boost in-work incomes. I think fair pay agreements, if they ever happen, would be a great thing. I think we need to find a way of strengthening trade unions again. And then to fund all of this, we have to address the really gaping holes in the New Zealand tax system, these enormous loopholes we've left, whereby, the richest families, we saw from the Inland Revenue research in April, pay on average about 9.4% of their income in tax, so less than someone who is stacking shelves in a supermarket, half the rate that the typical person in New Zealand pays. And that's very substantially because we don't tax capital gains in any coherent fashion. We also don't tax inheritances, even though inheritances and capital gains are just forms of income. They're income like my salary is income. Okay, they're lumpier, they're irregular, we've got different characteristics. It's all income, and it should be taxed as income, or failing that, the kind of wealth taxes or land taxes that other countries have as a backstop. But we need that greater contribution from people at the moment paying very little of their income in tax if we're going to fund the things we really need to uplift the rest of the country.
Thanks, Max. So that's it for the structured panel discussion. We'll now start to put some of the questions that you've put into the Q&A to the panelists. Just a reminder, I think we've probably already got more questions than we can answer. So please could ask our viewers if you'd like to see a particular question asked, do vote for it by clicking on the thumbs up, and that way the question is more likely to be asked. So first up, I have a question from Judy Blakely, asking about gendered inequality in New Zealand and the role that plays. We've talked mostly in terms of wealth and income inequality in New Zealand. I wonder if I could ask each of the panelists, perhaps starting with you, Ganesh, to reflect on gender inequality in New Zealand.
Well, without wanting to sit on the fence, the Productivity Commission, in terms of our report, we didn't have that. We searched for that data in terms of our dimensions and drivers, and we're restricted by the data, but it's well researched and well found in other areas around the gender pay gap. The way our labour market is structured doesn't allow for gaps in employment, and that impacts on lifetime earnings and lifetime opportunities. So yes, undoubtedly there is a gender dimension to inequality that we need to not only be aware of but to address. But I suppose without being too apologetic, it's one of those. I suppose it's one of the various dimensions, and everybody will have their own dimension. And one of the things that we struggled with in terms of our report is we did have many different organisations and individuals coming to tell us about what is the most important element that we needed to look at and address. All of those had well-researched case, but the challenge is to, dare I say, not wanting to belittle or downplay any of those individual dimensions, is to recognise that they all operate within that system. And undoubtedly that gender dimension for inequality is a reflection of that power imbalance that we've got embedded within the system. So yes, it's important to look at, but I wouldn't be looking at it in isolation to the broader system and all those other dimensions of inequality that are equally, I won't say depressing, but equally challenging to ensure that we address properly.
Thanks, Ganesh. Tania, Max, any comments?
Well, I'll just briefly comment on women's inequality, that part of gender inequality. And one of the things that we're really interested in is the care economy. Mm-hmm. Overwhelmingly, staffed by women. There is, a very clear case why the status of care need to be valued more. Hedge fund managers during those lockdowns, utterly useless. Nurses, care home assistants, those were the roles that that we depended on. Our people in our supermarkets making sure that we were fed, that I would all consider to be part of the care economy. They make sure that our basic welfare is being looked after, our teachers. So I think there needs to be a fundamental reset in how we prioritise different things. There was a really interesting study that the New Economics Foundation did in London, and it found that hedge fund managers had the lowest social return on investment and cleaners the highest. Now, I think that says everything, but you can't have a dignified living as a cleaner or a carer, certainly not in Auckland. You just can't earn enough. I'd just like to also make the comment about debt. So it is lone parent families that have the lowest median net wealth, and that shouldn't surprise us, but it should worry us incredibly, and that disproportionately falls on women. Ngā Tangata Microfinance, who are a fantastic organisation tackling those high interest fringe lenders. The overwhelming majority of their clients are wahine. So it tells you about, kind of like who is experiencing barriers to income and wealth, but also who's paying penalties on having to access incredibly expensive debt. The average interest rate that those wahine were paying to fringe lenders was 35%. And the equivalent of a third of their total income. No one can get up and out from that. And just the final word is about family harm and domestic violence and violence against women. We are world champions in that regard. It is a shameful state of affairs. And the Growing Up in New Zealand study has looked at 5 different indicators, and what happens when you remove certain things from people's lives. Does it get them above or below the line of vulnerability? Now, you can remove any number of combination of those indicators. If you don't remove domestic violence, women stay vulnerable. They stay under that line, even if you are tackling other indicators like housing or income. So the women's equality issue is more than just the pay gap. And it goes right to the heart of some very fundamental values about how we think about the mana of women and our value and our role.
Kia ora, Tania. Max, any quick reflections on that before we move to the next question?
Yeah, I mean, just a generalized reflection, sort of maybe less directly on the question itself, but on what Ganesh and Tania have been picking up on. I think what we're talking about here is partly economic exclusion, exclusion from the fruits of the economy, but also democratic exclusion or civic exclusion, people not being able to participate actually in the systems of power and systems of decision making. And I read it, and I think sort of more and more that what that creates is sort of a downward spiral for a lot of people, where despite their best efforts, they're living in poverty or marginalization, and so they quite understandably don't engage in the political system, or the political system doesn't create opportunities for them to engage. And so then that system is oriented towards the interests of those who do vote and engage in the powerful. And so inequality just gets worse. And those two things are very self-reinforcing when they're both exclusionary. And so I think the task is to try to set things on the upward spiral. And instead, where we're reducing economic disparities, more people feel empowered to participate in our systems of democracy. And we change those systems so actually that they work for everyone. And so we create citizens' assemblies and participatory budgeting, and we have more co-governance structures and everything else that's required. And then politics will be more responsive, I think, to the demands to further reduce inequality and so on and so forth. So I think it's those two big interwoven things, partly, that we're talking about here.
Thanks, Max. Okay, so the next question comes from Anne French, and again, I'll put the question to all panelists. And just before I ask that, just to note, some of our panelists may not be able to comment on specific political party policies, so feel free to answer this question in terms of the policies that would be effective here. So the last 6 years have been disappointing for people concerned about child poverty and inequality in New Zealand, and the 30 years that preceded them weren't great either. Which parties or policies that address these problems would be worth our vote? So as I say, feel free to respond kind of in a more general sense about the policies that would be effective in addressing child poverty and inequality in New Zealand. Let's start with you, Tania.
I'm one of those ones that has to be just a little bit careful, as I am employed as a public servant. But there is no doubt about it that we have a very long road ahead of us. One of our teams in our department is specifically looking at early years. And it includes working with a number of central government agencies to create systems change intervention. So not so much focused on what is it that parents need to be doing better, but to Ganesh's point about systems change, how does the public sector, which plays a huge role in people's lives, particularly people who are at the very pointiest end of inequality, the state is, in their lives fairly frequently. So what is it that the public sector can be doing better to create more enabling conditions, as actually described perfectly in the Productivities Commission's inquiry into fairness for all. I think that's probably where I would have to stop.
Great, thank you. Any quick reflections from Max or Ganesh?
Yeah, look, if I could add something to that, and I'll just see if I can share my screen again, because I happen to have a image on this. Hopefully everyone can see. This is a graph of child poverty rates. And look, these are the three main measures that the government uses to measure poverty under the Child Poverty Reduction Act. And I won't go into detail on them because we probably don't have time. But the overarching point is, if you go back to, just after the global financial crisis, so sort of 10, 15 years ago, the sort of rate, the number of children in poverty, it's up around 20, 25, 30% in some cases. And, over the last sort of decade plus, actually there have been pretty significant reductions in child poverty on some measures, including the hardship ones, which are just directly about asking families, what they do and don't have. And for me, actually, this is a bit of one of the untold success stories of New Zealand recently, which is that we actually have made some real inroads. Now, I'm not saying that everything's fine, because those poverty rates are still 10, 15%. That's still 1 child in 10 in poverty, and those rates can be twice as high for children from Māori Pacific backgrounds or in families where there's an adult with a disability. So there's a huge amount to go, but we have made some progress. The target is to, go from sort of, 1 child in 5 being poor back in 2010 to 1 child in 10 now, to get that down to 1 in 20 in a few years' time. And both major parties, at least rhetorically, are signed up to that. And I actually think that's encouraging. I mean, Tania's quite right. There's a huge road to go, and there's some very, very entrenched structural inequalities. But I think we can take heart from the fact that we actually have achieved some things as a country overall.
Thanks, Max. Next question. I have the same disclaimer. Panelists should feel free to answer it in a general sense rather than speaking to, in this case, the Green Party specific proposals. So, question from Sarah Salmon. Do the panelists think that the implementation of the Green Party's wealth tax and income guarantee would be beneficial for New Zealand? And the second part of the question, is there any realistic prospect of a capital gains tax being implemented in New Zealand in future as distinct from the bright line test? So I'll throw that open to the panel. Anyone would like to comment on it? Again, you can comment on the general principle of wealth taxes and income guarantees if you prefer.
I mean, I'm happy to have a go at that because it's possibly the easiest question for me to answer as someone who doesn't have a public position. Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of merit in both. Some people do talk about a universal basic income, but I'm not a huge fan of that in the sense of a payment that goes to literally everybody in the country, because then I think you have to spread the assistance too thin for it to be really meaningful. Conversely, the guaranteed minimum income, this idea that if you don't have income from paid work, you should receive a really generous benefit that allows you to live in dignity, and which, you don't have to have huge amounts of means testing and questions about your partner's relationship and so on and so forth. I think there's a lot of merit in that as something that helps restore dignity to people's lives, gives them that secure foundation from which they can build. And and I think there's a lot of merit in a wealth tax as well. I mean, a wealth tax is slightly more complex to make work than capital gains and inheritance taxes. I think the ideal scenario is you've got capital gains and inheritance taxes, so you're just taxing all kinds of income equally and fairly. But it's absolutely true that if you don't have either of those, a wealth tax kind of gets you to the same point, because how do the very wealthy save up their wealth? It's mostly from capital gains and inheritances. So up to a point, it comes back to the same thing. But whatever happens, I think the crucial point is you do have a lot of New Zealanders who are paying very little of their income in tax, and we have to close that loophole.
Great, thank you, Max. If no other comments, I'll move on to the next question.
Yes, that's my comment.
Okay, very good. So the next question, in terms of narrowing the distribution of income, what would the panel see as the best ways of doing this? For example, raising low incomes or minimum wage, introducing living wages, or reining in upper income brackets? Again, I'll throw that question open to the panel.
I suppose I would respond in the context of it's, yes, income is important. And I'll go back to Max's comment about the link to opportunities. And I think the economists generally have, in terms of our training, have consistently focused on choices. And I think we need to think about economics and our economics training and think about the constraints on those choices. It is in our textbook. I mean, the choices were always within constraints, but we've always, economists of my generation anyway, have always assumed that those constraints were never binding. There was always something that they were always far off and we didn't have to worry about them. But now we are recognising that those constraints are binding for many individuals and communities, whether it be the income constraint or the lack of opportunities that are then provided. And so rather than, I suppose, you could go down the narrowing the income disparity, but I'd also want to, I think, openly put it alongside ensuring that we have proactive measures to build opportunities across our communities and our individuals and households and regions and everywhere. And so whether that's the active labour market policies in terms of employment policies, whether that's education and workforce training, or dare I say, go all the way back to those first 1,000 days and let's start putting that investment into our whānau and our families to provide that safe nest to nurture our next generation.
Thank you, Ganesh. Tania?
I think it's all of those and more. So Max made the point, I think, about union membership, and there was a comment about that in the chat. It's no coincidence that after the Employment Contracts Act and what that did to the union movement, that Māori incomes, decreased pretty much overnight by 9%. So the more protections we have for Māori and Pasifika, the benefit is disproportionate. When we have those types of protections in the labour market, or whether it's an industrial policy, whatever it might be. I think there's also some very tactical things that we need to do. Part of I mean, South Auckland is hit over the head consistently. The reason you're poor is because you're uneducated and there's some kind of moral deficit in there usually as well. And it's always the supply side problem, right? But actually what we are finding is, what do you think happens when you've had an economy here, Tāmaki Makaurau, that has treated South Auckland like an unending reservoir of cheap brown labour for the last 50 years? Guess what happens? And we see that in the Equal Opportunities, Employment Opportunities Commissioner, Whaikaranina's work around, we can't explain some of the Pacifica pay gap. It can't be explained by lack of qualifications. It goes to Ganesh's point earlier about racism. We need to be, most South Aucklanders work, right? The problem is stuck in work poverty. And so we've seen like huge rates of underutilization. So we've got a little prototype that's happening at the moment, which is actually putting the responsibility on the demand side. So we're literally moving underutilized Pacifica workers out of those crappy jobs and into deserving employers, and literally doubling people's income. Now, that's a very, kind of pragmatic thing to do. But the first thing we had to do was properly diagnose the problem. What I see amongst my colleagues in the public sector, we need more training programs or da-da-da-da-da. Actually, yes, and we need more thorough analysis of what is actually happening. And so we, looked at the ILO's total utilisation work and applied that as a lens over what is happening in South Auckland, and that has led to these types of prototypes to show that actually we need to be doing multiple things all at the same time.
Kia ora, Tania. We're rapidly running out of time here, so if I could ask one panel member to reflect on, we've had a few questions about the interplay between climate change and inequality. If one of Tania, Max, or Ganesh could quickly reflect on that, and then we'll draw the webinar to a close.
I'm quite happy to, climate change is just yet another, I won't say just yet another, that downplays it, but is another impact that is going to hurt the vulnerable even more. So and again, I suppose it's part of that social contract. What are our obligations? Myself, as one in the privileged sector of the world, what are our obligations back the other way in terms of looking after the vulnerable communities who are not vulnerable for any of their choices? They are vulnerable because of the way the system has functioned. And so what are the obligations, responsibilities in that direction? And so whether it's climate change or whether it's that cost of living crisis or whatever it is, the question for me is, what are our obligations at that community level? Because climate change and all those other challenges, we're only ever going to solve it at that community and national level. Individuals on our own are not going to be able to solve or address those challenges at all.
Thank you, Ganesh. Okay, at this point, I will pass to each of the panelists to give us just one reflection at the end of the webinar on what they would like viewers to take away with them as they think about inequality in New Zealand. It could be an action they could take, or it could just be a lens or a way of thinking about it. And then I'll ask Tania to close the session with a karakia. So Max, why don't we start with you?
Yes, thanks, Murray, and thanks everyone for your contributions. And sorry we haven't been able to get to all the questions. Look, I think my sort of closing reflection would be twofold. I mean, first is just a very simple point that this is all tackling poverty and discrimination and exclusion. It's all doable. I just showed you a little glimpse of the fact that we have made some inroads into child poverty. We've also been a country with very different levels of economic inequality through our history, much lower at times, much higher at other times. None of this is fixed. It's all within our control to change it. But I think to really shift the dial on these things, we do need a different ethos, and one, I guess, which embeds a different view of the social contract, to come back to that language we were talking about earlier. And it's fundamentally a collective and a nurturing and a compassionate one, I think. We're seeing the increase of sort of rhetoric from National about kicking people off benefits and taking away their benefits and punishing them. And we just know from the evidence, the British evidence, for instance, that doesn't work because it's the wrong model. People who are on benefits aren't lazy or factless. They're struggling with huge difficulties, with really chaotic lives. Sanctions just adds more chaos, more problems to their lives. What they need is support. They need people alongside them, helping them use their strengths, helping them get back on their feet. And as part of that collective view, we also need a greater contribution from people at the top. They also need to see themselves as part of a collective, people who've done well, drawing on the collective public services, the collective infrastructure that was built with the taxes of previous generations. If they're going to be in a right relationship with that collective and the right relationship with future generations, they need to actually be paying their fair share of tax, replenishing that collective pool so it's there for people in future. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. Ganesh.
I suppose my reflection is, yes, it's complicated. And so let's not try and continue the search for the one simple solution or the one key solution that's going to solve everything overnight, or this one critical policy that all we need to do is intervene here and now and it's just going to wonderfully evaporate or solve our inequality problems overnight. And I think that's a challenge for many of us, because many of us operating within our own interest groups or within our own area of expertise or our own experience see a narrow perspective on what might solve that particular problem. And I think that's the challenge, is not expect a simple solution and not stop trying to search for that one solution, whether it's tax or spending or whatever it might be, because I think that's what's stopping us getting there. And it's very much, I suppose, from that, and I'll put myself in that basket, that Wellington bureaucrat perspective of that one intervention, the helicopter, we're going to come in on a helicopter and we're going to solve your problems or sort your family out because you're the one that are causing all the problems. It's that we've got to actually change that mindset. Those in persistent disadvantage are not the problem. Perhaps it's the system that's the problem. And so rather than expect the solution to come out of the system, is changing that system. So we actually, as Max says, those with power, those with privilege, need to see themselves as not only part of the problem, but part of the solution.
Thank you, Ganesh. Tania.
Oh, I think Max and Ganesh have summed it up beautifully and completely tautoko what they say. And then the only other thing, and vote for people who are at the pointiest end of inequality. That would be a wonderful gift, not just to the present, but actually one that is a lasting legacy. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Tania, and thank you all for joining today's webinar. Sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions. We'll see if there's some way we can answer some of them offline. But for now, thank you all very much for joining, and I'll hand back over to Tania for a closing karakia.
Pai, me whakakapi tō tātou wānanga, he mihi mahana kia koutou katoa, kua hari taku ngākau, engari, he take nunui, engari, ka hari ahau. Kia hore te marino, kia whakapapa paunamu te moana, hei huarahi mā tātou i te rangi nei, aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou ia tātou katoa. Mauri ora.
Kia ora, Tania. Thanks, everyone. We hope to see you back 2 November at 8 p.m. for a discussion with David Skilling. Otherwise, mate wa.